Let's go over multiplying radical expressions. So first let's start with the square root of 3 times the square root of 3. When we multiply this, we're going to get the square root of 9. And of course, this reduces down to 3. We add the square root of 5 times the square root of 5. This would be square root of 25, which would be 5. So if you look, radical 3 times radical 3 equals 3. Radical 5 times radical 5 equals 5. So therefore, radical 7 times radical 7 would just be 7. Radical 12 times radical 12 would just equal 12. So keep this in mind when we move forward through the lesson. So let's look at this. The square root of 5 times the square root of 7. Just going to multiply these together, and we'll get the square root of 35. Okay, and this cannot be simplified. Let's look at this one now. Square root of 18 times the square root of 2 is going to be the square root of 36, which we can do the square root of. It's going to be 6. Square root of 36 is 6. Alright, let's look at this a little bit more closely. What happens if we reduce these first? So radical 18 is really radical 9 times radical 2. The square root of 9 is 3. And radical 2 times radical 2 is just 2. So we get 3 times 2 also equals 6. So we can multiply this across and then do square root, or reduce it first and multiply it out. Let's say I have this one, square root of 15 times the square root of 45. So I can multiply this out. I'm going to do it on the side. 45 times 15. 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times 2 is 20, plus 2 is 22. 1 times 5 is 5. 1 times 4 is 4. Let's add this up. So this comes out to radical 675. Now I have to break this down. So this is a pretty large number. Maybe a little difficult to break this up, but let's see what goes into this. I know 25 does. It's going to be radical 25 times radical something. I don't know what that something is, so I have to divide. 25 goes into 67 twice, 50. So now bring down to 5, and 25 goes into 175 7 times. So it's radical 25, radical 27. Now break this down. The square root of 25 is 5. Then square root of 27. This can be broken down. Radical 9, radical 3. The square root of 9 is 3. So I have 15 radical 3. So here we multiply them together and then broke down this large number. Let's see what happens if we first reduce it. Alright, so I have radical 15 times radical 45. This doesn't really break down, it's just radical 15. Okay, but this one does. Into 9, and radical 9 and radical 5. The square root of 9 is 3. So radical 15 times 3 times radical 5. So I have 3 times radical 15 times radical 5, which is radical 75. Now this breaks down. 3, radical 25, radical 3. So radical 25 is 5. And again I end up with 15 radical 3. So the number of steps in this case are about the same, but here I dealt with much smaller numbers the entire time instead of this large number. Now I want to look back at a point here. So radical 15, radical 45. So radical 15, I said didn't break down. Radical 45 does. Radical 9, radical 5. But now looking back at this, I see a radical 5 here. I know 5 goes into here, so let me break this up. So radical 3 and radical 5. Even though I can't do the square root of either one, I'm still going to break them up. So radical 3, radical 5, radical 9, radical 5. Let me just reorganize this, or reorder these. So I'll put the radical 9 first, just so you can see what's going on. Then radical 5. The other radical 5. Radical 3. So the square root of 9 is 3. Radical 5 times radical 5 is, of course, just 5. Then I have radical 3. So 3 times 5 is 15, radical 3.